He slams his phone down on the arm of the couch. He had had enough at this point. Social media and people were just tools to mess with the brain, and his brain was messed with. He became angry after seeing so many pictures that did nothing but scream to him how much better their life was compared to his sad one. David sat on the couch, holding his hands, shaking, while photos of all the people he knew smiling and having fun together flashed through his mind. They were having fun. Having fun. Without him. He began to feel his heart crash against his chest over and over, with each beat blaring in his ears. The walls were closing in on him, and the room was getting smaller. He had to get out. He had to get out. David stood up and stomped to the back door. He stepped outside and sat on the doorstep, alone in the pitch black. The perfect activity for a Saturday night. He looked out across his backyard, focusing on the darkness that veiled his surroundings as he tried to steady his breathing. So lonely, he muttered solemnly to himself as he looked out into the sky and back to the garden. It's surprising how the imagination can change shapes into life form in the darkness. At that moment, David could have sworn he saw a small figure moving at the bottom of the garden. The movements looked awkward and uncomfortable. Not human looking enough to be a person, but not object looking enough to be an object either. David began to feel weary of his surroundings in his own house. He felt so lonely, so very lonely. Then why did he feel as though he was being watched? His eyes fell once more on the dark moving mass at the bottom of the garden and watched as it bobbed messily from side to side. It reminded him of how an animal acts when it is unsure of whether it is safe to approach or not. He stood up and squinted, trying to get a clearer look at what that thing was. But no matter how hard he tried, it was still an unintelligible mass. Just the darkness playing tricks on me, he sighed to himself, turning to the door handle to head back inside. Wait, said a small, soft voice. He jerked around and scanned the garden frantically, but there was no one there. The voice had sounded like it would come from someone standing directly next to him, but he could see no one there. Wait, came the small voice again. Who is it? David blurted out stupidly. He was suddenly reminded of the stupid characters in the horror movies he had watched. Yeah, like whatever's there is gonna jump out and be all, hey, yep, it's me. Why do you do that? Asked the soft voice. It sounded as though a young child was speaking directly into David's ear when it spoke. Although it merely sounded like a child, he was afraid. Afraid of the unknown per se. Though it reminded him of how a child would sound, it did not sound childlike at all. Do what? David asked the voice while backing up against the door. So often you come outside in the so late hours of the night, with tears in your eyes while talking at the stars, the voice said dreamily. Why is that? David stared blankly at the darkness, 100 thoughts rushing through his mind. What was this? Fear was setting in, and confusion began to fog his train of thought. Who is this? He called out weakly, his breathing uneven and his voice audibly shaken. I asked you a question, he said dumbly. I guess humans have a tendency to become angry at those they do not understand. I did also. The voice paused. Ask you a question. David did not answer. He just kept scanning the dark garden for any sign of another human, another person, any sign at all.
"I don't think I am what you're looking for,"
it said.
"I am not sure I am what you humans call human."
It said this as though reading David's thoughts.
"Isn't that what you crave? Another human?"
The voice said, quivering with its high-pitched tones. "No," David replied, rather defensively. The voice came again.
"Then, what is it that you crave?"
David did not answer. His stomach was flipping with fear and unsurety.
"Is it happiness that you crave?"
There was a silence.
"Humans tend to really like that."
David's chest heaved up and down as he tried pacing his heavy breath.
"I could make you happy, David,"
the voice said sweetly. How do you know my name?" he blurted out without thinking.
"Oh, David, I've known you for a long time."
The voice sounded sweet, almost reassuring, but there was something off-putting about it that made David find himself backing up closer against the door. He didn't reply, so it asked again.
"What is it that you crave? I can give it to you,"
it said softly. Mercedes, David joked, masking his very present fear with humor, chuckling to himself a little.
"Okay,"
chimed the wispy voice.
"Will this help you to be happy?"
David thought back to Alexander Payton from his old high school, the boy with the expensive car that always had the girls all over him and respect from all the guys. Sure, David replied dismissively, before realizing what he was doing. Talking to a phantom voice in his back garden, he shook his head and turned to head back inside, chuckling to himself. Maybe he had been drinking a bit too much. The next day, he got up for work, got dressed quickly in a button-up shirt he had picked randomly from the closet, grabbed the car keys, and quickly got into his car and went on to his work. The same old, same old. He pulled up in a space in the car park reserved for his workplace and got out, making sure to lock the car before walking off into the beige building. "Wow!" came a voice from behind him. "Nice car!" David's ears perked up and he sprang round to see his colleague, Tommy Peters, with an idiotic-looking smile on his face as he looked at David and then back to the car. He was looking at a Mercedes. David began to stammer softly. What? He began walking towards where Tommy stood, admiring the car. It was a shining black Mercedes, sitting exactly where David had parked his same old car. What? David began to stammer quietly once again, joining Tommy with staring at the shiny, extravagant car. David began to think a million thoughts in 1 second. "She sure is a beauty," Tommy said, clapping David on the shoulder and walking past him smiling. But David still stood there frozen, not saying a word, just staring blankly at the car in awe. A few seconds passed before he finally came to his senses, and he smiled smugly to himself, looking at his car keys before heading into work. He didn't understand, but he didn't need to. He got what he wanted, and that's all that mattered. That day, many people approached him, asking about his car with excited bright eyes, asking to see it, to take a drive in it, to even merely just sit in it for a few seconds. Tommy must have spread the word real well. Ah, please let me drive in it. Just only around the block, come on. I've always made you real great cups of coffee, right? Do this solid for me. Mason Samuels would say. Hey, I've heard you got something new and shiny. Care to take me for a ride in it one day? Sarah Willings would ask. Oh man, I've never seen such a car in my life. You're really up the game, Tommy Peters would tell him. His popularity peaked, and David relished in the glory. He bathed in every word, basking in the pride of it all. To him, he had become a legend, and couldn't have asked for more. That was, however, until people had begun to forget about his new vehicle. Days went on, work piled up, news became news, and things changed. Less and less people had asked about his car. They had run out of phrases to feed his ego with. They were uninterested now. He had become normal again. No one seemingly appeared to care about the shiny black article that sat outside. The shock factor had worn off. They had become bored. Once again, David had found himself sat alone on the couch. Another dream dead. This night in particular, he was feeling the bittersweet pang of loneliness. He had failed to make not even a single friend. And a girlfriend? Oh, well, that was out of the question. He sat forward, his elbows resting on his knees, head in his hands, blatantly ignoring the blaring TV playing in front of him, casting colourful shadows that danced across his dark foam. He was met with that all-too-familiar feeling again. The walls began to close in on him, the room growing smaller and smaller while his breath grew deeper and deeper. Panic slowly setting in. He sprang up, feeling the need to escape, and headed out the back door. He shut the door behind him and looked up at the dark, open sky. He was reminded of that voice. He jumped at the memory. Was it fear or shock? He couldn't tell. But as if reading his mind, there came a voice.
Why do you do that?
Came the wispy voice. What? David snapped back, not really registering the eerie quality of the soft voice this time.
You have come outside in the so late hours of the night again, with tears in your eyes while looking at the stars.
David felt his anger boil over, but he did not offer the voice a reply.
Why is that?
David said nothing.
Did what you asked for not offer you solace?
What? David hissed, wringing his hands in anticipation. He paused and sat on the doorstep, placing his head in his hands, rocking back and forth slightly. Oh, how the lonely stung.
Do you still have yet to find happiness?
The voice asked softly. No, David snapped, lifting his head from his palms and trying to spot the dark moving mass he had saw last time.
Oh,
the voice replied sweetly.
What is it that you crave?
There came an eerie silence in the darkness.
I can give you what you crave, David. What is it that would provide happiness?
David thought for a moment. He thought back to Alexander Payton again. He now had the same car as him, but he didn't feel how Alexander had always looked. David wasn't content, or even happy per se. But Alexander always seemed so calm, so happy, so content, so well dressed. That was it. I want clothes. The words fell from his mouth. Nice ones. The type that's very expensive. He turned to enter that house without another word. The following weeks he was complimented over and over by his colleagues. He had the attention he wanted from girls. He had the guys asking him for advice on how he managed to look so good each day and how they could do the same. For a few weeks it went on like this, and David relished in the attention. But once again, the novelty wore off, and people got used to the David with the nice car and the posh clothes. That's all he was. That's all he became. So David began to ask for more. He found himself in the same situation, head in his hands, feeling anxious and lonely, wanting more. The walls began to close in on him once again as he began to panic. Like clockwork, he went outside to his garden to sit on the doorstep and look at the stars.
"Why do you do that?"
The voice came again. He welcomed the voice this time, but did not reply.
"Again, you have come to look at the stars with tears in your eyes. Why is that?"
He began, but found himself trailing off.
"Do you have yet to find happiness, David?"
David did nothing but sigh as he looked down at his hands. They were shaking. "Yes," he uttered finally.
"What is it that you need? I can give it to you,"
the sweet voice offered gently. David was silent for a moment, lost in his own thoughts. He thought of Alexander Peyton again. He always seemed so happy, so content, so proud. He wanted so desperately to have that. He thought about what Alexander Peyton had that he didn't. He had his car, his clothes. What was missing? Finally coming to an idea, he said, I want to have good looks. I want to look better."
"David,"
the voice said gently,
"you must be content with those that you cannot change."
He became angry. David didn't like the sound of this. "I thought you could help me to be happy," he said, a little too harshly.
"Of course, but you must understand, some things are limited, subjective to the individual."
He was quiet for a moment, trying to pace his annoyance. After a few seconds of deep thought, he perked up with an idea. "What if I always appeared attractive to others?" he said excitedly.
"Okay,"
chimed the voice. David stood up, rolled back and forth on his heels a few times in anticipation, and then turned to head back into the house, leaving the darkness behind. And so, the voice did as it promised. Suddenly he began to get a lot of attention. A lot of attention. Both admiration and envy. For a while he basked in the glory and the attention he had received from many women. For a long time he found himself heading out more often, enjoying the attention he received from many different women. For a few weeks, he was happy. But as time went on, he found that attraction was the only thing women felt towards him. He found that the minute relationships he did have with his colleagues began to loosen, and they began to grow distant. Mason Samuels would brush off his pleasant greetings in the morning. Sarah Willings would walk past him with her head down, growing bored of him. Tommy Peters would merely flash him a smile and a nod of their head while David passed him on the way to get coffee. Even he, himself, had become bored of the attention he received from the women. After a while, it began to feel empty. He wanted something more. He missed having conversations, discussions. Hell, he even missed arguing about his work with the other colleagues. He found himself in the same place, again, sitting on the same couch, the same position, the same feeling, sitting with his head in his hands, feeling dismayed and anxious and lonely. He took a few deep breaths before standing up promptly and quickly scurrying out to his garden, being welcomed by the cold and the darkness. This time, he did not wait for the voice. "Hello?" he called out, feeling a twinge of humility at the absurdity of his actions. There was no answer, So he called out over and over to the voice. Hello? 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 But there still was no answer. Growing increasingly more and more worried and anxious, feeling defeated, he took a seat on the doorstep. Please. He desperately begged under his breath finally.
Why do you do that?
The voice came. David shot up, wiping tears from the corner of his eyes sheepishly. He didn't wait for it to say more. Please, David said again. I need... He trailed off. I need... He attempted the sentence once again, but found himself trailing off again. I just need more. He sounded defeated, lost.
Do you still have yet to find happiness, David?
Yes, I do. I need something else, he replied, feeling flustered.
What is it that you crave?
Offered the voice sweetly. David thought back to Alexander Payton again. But he found himself at a dead end. He had everything he had. His car, his looks, his clothes, his charms, his respect. But still he found himself lost. He had felt happy, proud, confident, surprised, excited. And sad. But one feeling prevailed. Lonely. I want a friend, David let out quickly. Feeling sure, he said it again with a nod. I want a friend. He then turned to go back inside the house.
Finally, you have seen the truth,
chimed the voice. David stopped in his tracks and turned back to the garden. What? He snapped in confusion.
You have finally seen the truth to your craving,
the voice replied calmly. If you knew what I would eventually want, why keep it from me? Why didn't you just give it to me in the first place? He told the voice, his annoyance sounding when he spoke.
I could only give you what you asked for, David. You had time. I knew that was to be needed,
chimed the voice in reply. David didn't answer, his anger and annoyance reaching a peak. The voice came again.
It is what you crave, isn't it?
Asked the soft voice. Yes! David hissed, inwardly feeling embarrassed.
Okay,
chimed the voice once again. David turned to head back into his house, leaving the cold and the darkness behind. That morning he went about his routine as normal, showering, brushing his teeth, picking out a new button-up shirt and well-fitted trousers, but was stopped at breakfast. David was surprised to come down the stairs to see a man sitting on his couch with his legs crossed. Dude, have you seen this? His arm was extended to point at the TV, still with the remote in hand. Just that, bro. He finished, his mouth full of cereal. David just stood there frozen, staring at the man that sat on his couch in sweatpants, obliviously eating away at his cereal. Seriously, dude, it don't get worse than this. The man said again, eyes transfixed on the television. David didn't say a word. He just slowly walked over to the couch and sat beside the man. His mind was blank. The reporter's voice filled the room, their grave tone playing distantly as David was lost in thought. It took a while for him to gather his thoughts. The man noticed David's stiff body as he sat frozen and leant forward to get a better look at his face. Dude, are you okay? Asked the man on his couch, tapping him on the shoulder with the back of his hand, trying to break David's blank face. David flinched at the man's touch, pulling away from him. Dude! the man exclaimed, flabbergasted. But David stood up and took a step away from the man that sat on the couch, staring mystified at the man's stunned and confused face. But he backed away from him further. "Are you okay? What's up, man? You can tell me. Come on, we've been mates forever." David let himself do nothing but venture through his thoughts for a mere second. Suddenly he knew the man's name, his surname, his middle name, his most embarrassing moments, the time he'd felt the most pain while falling from a tree they had both climbed together and broke his arm. He knew who he went to prom with, how he stuck up for him while people picked on him as a kid at school, how he had a crush on the German teacher, how they went to the same theme park on their 23rd birthdays, which were conveniently very close. His mind was filled with 1,000 pleasant memories of the man that sat on the couch. A friend. Joseph? David said wearily. "Yeah, what's up?" Joseph asked, sounding concerned. Nothing, David told, taking a seat on the couch, smiling to himself. "You sure?" Joseph asked. "Freaked out for a bit there," he said with a chuckle. "Yeah, I'm okay," he chuckled back. "Those late nights get into you, bud," Joseph said, turning his attention back to his cereal and the television. David left to work that day with a smile on his face. He had someone to talk to, someone to head out with, someone to watch TV with, someone to drink beer with. A friend. Many weeks went by spending time with Joseph. Many days of watching sports, drinking beer, talking about women and reminiscing, just merely enjoying the days. He no longer felt the pangs of loneliness. He was happy, content, no longer craved a thing. But after a while, David began to notice things. He began to notice things that were just off. They were small and insignificant, but they unsettled David to the core the times he had noticed them. The first thing David had noticed was, sometimes, while Joseph spoke, his voice would crack and sound incredibly deep and low for a few words, and then spring back to normal. Joseph never acknowledged it, and David brushed it off. But more things began to happen that David found very hard to ignore. Sometimes, his joints would bend the wrong way. Joseph would casually put the milk back into the fridge with a swift motion of bending his elbow backwards behind his back, pulling at the fridge's handle before putting the milk back in the fridge calmly. Sometimes his eyes would flicker to a different color and stay that way for a few hours or days before flicking to the last color they were while he talked to David. Sometimes David could see each and every one of Joseph's veins clearly through his skin. They would slowly rise to the surface as they pulsed. Purple and blue lines mapped across his face and body. David noticed that day by day, Joseph began to look more gaunt and weak. His eyes began to bulge, and the purple rings under his eyes began to darken. As the weeks went on, David saw that Joseph had become dangerously skinny, his bones visible through his skin. But he never seemed fazed. Joseph remained the same old good friend he had always been. More and more, Joseph felt fake and uncomfortably unreal to David. He just didn't feel right. It just all felt off to David. He noticed all memories he had with Joseph were completely and solely positive. Not a single bad memory. Not one. Joseph had never been late, had never lost his temper, had never even annoyed David in any way. It just wasn't plausible. He knew something was wrong. So very wrong. Some things that Joseph did would utterly shock David to the point of mental exhaustion. Sometimes, Joseph would eat the spoon after he had finished his cereal, or slide the glass down his throat after he had finished a glass of water, with not even a fleck of discomfort on his face. David noticed that Joseph's teeth moved ever so slightly as he talked. They swam calmly as he laughed at his own jokes. Everything Joseph did began to unsettle David greatly. He found himself trying hard to avoid Joseph more and more. It made him uncomfortable to be around him, scared even. He knew he wasn't human. The confusion and indecisiveness of craving a friend's company, but feeling incredibly unsettled by Joseph's habits, began to get to him. The indecisive emotions began to exhaust David, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get used to Joseph's manner. Now, knowing that Joseph wasn't real, it dawned credulously on David. Everything began to feel false, vague, useless. He began avoiding Joseph as much as he could. Joseph didn't mind. Of course he wouldn't. That night, David found himself met with something very familiar. The pang of loneliness. But this time, the sting seemed to intensify. The last straw was when he had to endure Joseph's sickly, gaunt body and dead eyes, still accompanied with that perky, upbeat voice as he greeted him this morning with a, "Hey, bro!" Oblivious to the mere eerie sight of him and his insufferable habits. David sat alone on the couch at the late hours of the night, his head in his hands as he cursed himself for not being able to push past Joseph's weird habits and not being content with this empty shell of a friend. The walls began to close in. He had to get out. He had to get away. He opened the back door quietly so that Joseph wouldn't hear, and sat on the doorstep, looking to the sky as he focused on nothing else but his breathing.
Why do you do that?
Those words. David didn't know whether to welcome them or hate them.
You have come to look at the stars with tears in your eyes again. Why is that?
Asked the wispy voice. David didn't answer. There was something different about the voice. Something just not right. It was hardly noticeable, but David could feel something wrong. "I was happy," David told the voice solemnly, "but I ruined it." David stumbled across his words.
Were you not content, David?
Asked the voice sweetly. I don't know. He tripped over his words as he tried to find his way through his thoughts.
Did I give you what it is that you crave?
Yes. David sounded defeated. But it wasn't enough. His eyes began to fill, and he shut them tight, pushing back the tears. This is when he registered that the voice had an ever so slightly different sound to it. It sounded slightly strained, exhausted even. "It wasn't real," David said, with a sigh, opening his eyes and catching sight of the dark moving mass at the bottom of the garden.
What is it that you crave has left me exhausted. I could give you what you crave, but my power is limited.
"It wasn't real," repeated David, not listening to what the voice had been saying. "All I wanted was company, but it wasn't real," David said under his breath more so than in a reply to anything.
I can give you what you crave, David,
came the voice again, in its sweet tone. "You already did," David replied, sounding defeated.
I can give you what you crave, David.
The voice repeated, still sounding sweet. David's eyes were still on the dark mass as it began to shift messily. David didn't say a word, his eyes transfixed on the darkness.
I am real,
spoke the voice in its sing-songy tone. David stood up and leant forward, squinting at the moving mass at the bottom of the garden. His curiosity had piqued. He took a step closer in the direction of the darkness.
I can give you what you crave, David.
The soft voice still sounded as though someone had spoken directly into his ear. But he took a step closer. He was now transfixed on the messy mass of darkness as it paced with awkward movements at the bottom of the garden. David did not understand, but he was getting what he wanted, and that's all that mattered. He took another step, and another. Closer and closer he stepped into the darkness, until he could get no closer. Weeks went by, weeks without a black Mercedes at the office's car park, weeks without anyone showing off their new clothes, weeks without the attractive man showing up at the bar or the club, weeks without David. Many of his colleagues thought he had merely quit his job without notice. They didn't know him. Who were they to question his decisions, right? But Tommy Peters. Tommy did not understand. Tommy missed David. He missed the conversations they had had at the coffee maker. He missed discussing work and the next step to a project with him. Heck, he even missed the occasional argument. He grew concerned. It began to bother him so often, so profusely, that he decided he would do some investigating himself. That day, Tommy decided to drop by David's house on the ride home from work to check up on him. Tommy parked in David's street and left his car to head to David's house, remembering where it was from the time David had left his book bag at work and he had brought it to him. Tommy got to the front door and knocked firmly on its glass. But as he did, he noticed the door was already ajar. He pushed it open gingerly. Calling out to David, feeling dread rest at the pit of his stomach, he entered the house, looking in each of the rooms, still calling out, "David!" Tommy began to feel the uncomfortable warmth of anxiety fill his body, but there was no sign of David. Tommy found himself in David's kitchen, staring out into his garden as dread began to rise up further into his throat, until he noticed the back door was slightly open too. Tommy pushed the door open and stepped on the doorstep, feeling defeated. He looked out into the garden, staring at the darkness, anxiety pushing its way through his ribcage. "Where are you, David?" Tommy whispered to himself, feeling defeated. But then, Tommy was taken aback by what he had heard, sounding like being directly spoken to into his ear. David's voice. He had asked Tommy a question. What? Asked Tommy. Tommy was confused to have heard David's voice, but he couldn't help but feel relief. He didn't understand, but he was getting what he wanted, and that's all that mattered. He called out to him again, this time listening closely to what David had to say. David's voice came again. "Why do you do that?"